So when looking at the cervical and thoracic vertebrae, first thing we need to find is the bifid or bifid spinous process. So this occurs on actually vertebrae C2 right through to C6. Is a bifid spinous process. So your spinous process again was that process sticking out the back, and we notice that it splits into two. So that is the bifid spinous process. Only occurs in the cervical vertebrae, but not all cervical vertebrae. Your transverse foramen, again, only occurs in cervical vertebrae. So foramen was referring to holes. Your transverse foramen is these holes that occur in the sides of the vertebrae. You'll notice them there. You'll notice them again there. You'll notice them again here, occurring in all cervical vertebrae. Now, the increased need for the holes relates to increased nerve and blood vessels that are running up to go to the brain. So cervical vertebrae have got more holes in them because there's more nerves and blood vessels running through this portion of the body. The atlas is just the blanket name given to C1. So C1 also referred to as the atlas, which is just signified by a ring of bones. C2 is called the axis. So this is the name given to the whole C2, very specific names. Easy way to remember that is because the atlas rotates on its axis. And it rotates around this bony projection here called the dens or odontoid process. C7 is the name given to the vertebra prominens. It's called the vertebra prominens because the spinous process in C7 is quite predominant. It sits at the base of your neck and sticks out a little bit more than all the other spinous processes in that section of the body. And finally, we've got demifacets. And demifacets are referring to only the thoracic vertebrae or part there of a thoracic vertebrae. The demifacet is actually where the rib head articulates with the body of the vertebrae. So this is actually quite a difficult section that people have trouble with. So the head of a rib touches the side of a body at the demifacet, but the rib tubercle also articulates with the transverse process. Actually does more than that, but because a rib actually touches two vertebral bodies at the demifacets. So the reason for the term demifacets, demi just referring to small facets, is that the rib just articulates with the top part of the vertebral body and the very bottom part of the body above. So it joins just like that. So only just touching the vertebral bodies. So demifacets are two small facets that occur just on the sides of the vertebral bodies. So in station 5, we're asked to identify bony landmarks of any bone. We'll start with a typical vertebrae. Now, the word typical vertebrae just means that all of these landmarks occur on all the vertebrae, because there's no such vertebrae as a typical vertebrae. So here we're looking at a thoracic vertebrae. So we'll start with superior and inferior articulating processes and facets. So when looking at vertebrae, superior meaning the top, the whole lump there is a superior articulating process. There's another one there. But just the shiny smooth surface on it would be the superior articulating facet. So again, the whole lump is the process and just the shiny surface is the facet. And similarly underneath, we've got the inferior articulating process being the whole lump and facet being the shiny surface. Next, we've got the pedicle. Now the pedicle refers to the bridge of bone that's between the body of a vertebrae and the rest of the vertebrae. So these two little bridges in here that attach these two structures together, they would be the pedicles. The spinous process of a vertebrae is this bony projection which sticks straight out the back. So when you look at a vertebrae or you look at your own body, often you can see these little lumps all the way down your spine. What you're seeing there is the spinous processes, or these little pointy things coming out the back. The lamina is either side of the spinous process, so these flat bits of bone that lie either side of the spinous process. The transverse process are the two bony projections that come out the transverse or the lateral side of the vertebrae. So transverse meaning side, processes, transverse process. The body of a vertebrae is this large flat part of the vertebrae. This is where the invertebral discs sit on top. So the idea or the reason we have a body is somewhere really for these invertebral discs to sit. And finally, you've got the vertebral foramen, which is the hole that runs straight through the middle of each vertebrae. So here we're looking at three different typical vertebrae from each of the sections. So this is C3 to C6, somewhere in there. I know that because it's got the transverse foramen, which are those two holes in the lateral sides of the vertebrae. And it's also got the bifid spinous process, so the spinous process splitting into two. Over here I've got the thoracic vertebrae. The easiest way to look at this, it's got the facets facing in that frontal or coronal plane, and it's got the pointed down spinous process. And over here I've got the lumbar vertebrae. Lumbar vertebrae's got the facets sort of in that sagittal plane or sort of obliquely facing each other, and it's got a blunt sort of squat facing straight back spinous process. So that much we kind of have from the video, but in addition to that, what are the main differences between these vertebrae? Well, we can look at the size for starters. So they definitely get larger as they get lower. And the law that explains this is called Wolff's Law. And Wolff's Law states that a bone responds to the stress that's placed upon it. So the lumbar is bigger than the cervical because it carries more weight, which is, more of the upper part of the body. Cervical, on the other hand, is pretty much only carrying the head, so the bony structure in the cervical is going to be a lot smaller because there's less weight above it. The other ways we can tell them apart is the shape. So the shape of the bodies is really different in each of these vertebrae. First, we've got I guess it's harder to explain is the shape of the cervical vertebrae, and it's generally called a triangular type shape, and it is hard to see in this particular picture here or this particular vertebrae here, but the body is often referred to as a triangle shape. Over here we've got the thoracic vertebrae. The thoracic vertebrae is often referred to as a heart shape, and that's a little bit more obvious because you can see it sort of goes to a point there and it sort of dips in at the top there, so it's very much a heart type shape. And over here we've got the lumbar vertebrae, which is usually the body there is referred to as the kidney bean type shape. So it's a bean shape, it goes, so there's a little indent there and it goes around. And each of the vertebrae in those particular sections have that type of shape. Now, the question where we'll ask ourselves is, why does it have a body at all? Well, what sits on the body is the invertebral disc. So each of these bodies has a disc which sits directly on it, with the vertebrae above it, sort of the disc being sandwiched between the two bodies of the vertebrae. And the reason for this, invertebral disc is, number one, shock absorption, and number two, being able to just sort of collapse a little bit at the edges, front, back, left to right, creates a little bit of movement. So you're able to get more movement through your vertebrae as opposed to just having each of these bodies sort of one on top of the other. There's a little bit of give in there. What all the vertebrae have in common is this hole running through the middle. This is called the vertebral foramen. And the vertebral foramen is really the house or the protection for the spinal cord, which runs right down through the vertebrae. Now, the only other difference on the thoracic vertebrae is the demifacets. And again, they're very difficult to see. They're almost impossible to see, but you can see here in the side of the body, you've got little kind of smooth sections, one at the top, one at the bottom. That's the demifacets. Very hard to see. But what the demifacets are for is the connection where a rib head attaches into the side of that body. So right on that demifacet would be just the edge of that rib head attaching to that demifacet. And of course, the rib attaching in two places, one the head to body and two up here between the transverse process and the rib tubercle. And it's important to note as well that these are both gliding plane joints, which we'll come to at some point throughout the next laboratory. Notice as well that the demifacets I've only talked about with reference to the thoracic vertebrae. The reason for that is the thoracic vertebrae are the only vertebrae that contains the ribs. So there's 12 thoracic vertebrae, there's also 12 pairs of ribs.